So, but I have to tell you, Jeff invited me along here, and I was really thrilled at the opportunity because I've been looking for different opportunities to speak and tell my story. And an opportunity to speak in front of a group and tell the story is something I'm always looking forward to. But when he told me the day that we chose to do this, I got goosebumps because my story is about my mother's suicide predominantly, and today would have been my mother's 74th birthday, so it's a little bit poignant. I will also tell you that some parts of this story might be a little bit hard to hear, so if you hear something and I upset you, I'm not trying to upset you, it's just a natural part of what happened. It's a rather difficult story to tell. But I'd like to talk about my experience living with or in the shadow of mental illness. I've been dealing with mental illness for over 40 years now. And I can tell you that mental illness is something that will devastate a family. If you or someone you know suffers from mental illness, if it's going on in someone's house, you probably don't know about it because it's the one illness that we have in our society that we're not able to really talk about. We don't share our story, people that suffer from mental illness, because it's the only illness I know of that there's still stigma associated with it. The only non-public or non-social disease where there's still stigma associated with having the disease. So for example, mental illness is the only illness I know where we'll tell someone that's suffering from it, hey man, you just need to get over it. You need to turn that frown upside down and put a smile on your face. When someone's suffering from a disease, you wouldn't think about saying that to someone that suffers from cancer, but people with mental illness, they hear this kind of thing all the time. The other thing that's kind of ironic and interesting about it, so if people suffer this illness alone, but one of the best ways to help overcome mental illness is to actually come and talk about it. So opportunities tonight to talk about mental illness is something that it's therapeutic for me, and hopefully this will be informative for this group. So my journey began back in 1979 when I was 8 years old. My mother had just given birth to my sister, and what the doctors originally had thought was postpartum depression turned into full-blown psychosis pretty quickly. And one day, completely out of the blue, my mother lost her mind, literally. She took a hammer, she took a knife, and she took paint, and she destroyed everything we had in our home. She used the hammer to destroy all the fixtures in the bathrooms. Everything was completely and utterly destroyed. She knifed up all my father's suits. All of our furniture was completely knifed up and destroyed. And she used paint, gallons and gallons of this beige paint. It was the 70s after all. It was all over everything in our house. Everything was completely covered in this paint. She wasn't quite done with that though. She took everything in the kitchen, every glass we had, every plate we had. She took and destroyed it on the floor. She took everything out of the refrigerator and threw the food all over, everywhere on the ground floor of our home. When she was done with that part of the rampage, she went upstairs and she filled the tub with water and she tried to electrocute herself and my infant sister in the tub. And fortunately enough, she survived. But she wasn't done. She took my father's brand new car out in the country and drove the car at high speed into a stand of trees. Now, I've got a picture of this that I can share if anybody wants to see it, but the only thing that survived on this car were the tires. There was nothing left of this car. The car was completely disintegrated, okay? Now, following this, just getting through the physical part of my mother's injuries, she spent 100 days in the hospital. 100 days trying to overcome just her physical trauma from this particular accident. Now, interesting side note about that. Can anybody kind of guess as to what that cost? The cost to have somebody stay in a hospital for 100 days in 1979? It cost $0. That's the way insurance used to work. My father worked for a company and the cost was $0. Can you imagine what something like that would do to a family today?
Over $1 million.
Oh, it would completely devastate a family. It would completely and utterly devastate a family. So, but once she got out, I spent the rest of my childhood living under the shadow of my mother's mental illness. She would always tell me how much she hated me and how much she disliked me and how much she wished I had never been born. So she hectored me relentlessly about everything about me that she didn't like, always letting me know. And the worst part about it wasn't that. The worst part of it was when I got off that school bus every single day, I never knew what I was coming home to. Was she going to be jovial? Was she going to be awake? Was she going to be alive? I had no idea what to expect any part of my childhood. I never knew what was waiting for me. My mother's second major attempt in her life took place in 1995. One day, again, completely out of the blue, she took 10 gallons of gasoline and dumped it all over every inch of my father's house and stood in the middle of the house and lit a match. Again, she survived this because the heat got to be too much and she came out and her survival instinct overtook. But once again, my father lost everything he had for the second time from my mother trying to take her own life because she didn't want to be alive. Now this was the beginning of the end for her. She did survive this, but my father and she divorced not long after this because my father he was a patient man, but he only had so much patience that he could withstand losing everything for the second time. So my sister ended up living with my father, and my mother ended up more and more isolated, more and more alone. So what she would do is she would call me on the phone. I was an adult. I had a family of my own by this point in time. She'd call me on the phone and tell me how much she didn't want to be alive and how she didn't have any reason to live. And I spent a long time, I spent about a year hanging with her, telling her, Mom, you've got a reason to live. Mom, we love you. Mom, you need to stay alive. We need you. But eventually I reached the point where I snapped. And I just no longer could take it anymore. My last words to her, Mom, you just need to do it. You need to go ahead and take your life and end it because I can't keep you alive. She knew I couldn't keep her alive. I knew I couldn't keep her alive. And we knew she was eventually going to do it. So in early 1996, one day, she went and she changed her will. And she bequeathed me a Cadillac. Not long after she did that, she took that Cadillac, she drove it into her garage, and she ran a hose from the exhaust pipe over to the driver's side window and went through an entire tank of gas and left me the automobile that she used to kill herself. Now I had to drive that car for 10 hours. I was living in North Carolina at the time. This took place up in Dayton. I had to drive that car down to North Carolina because it was the only way I had to get home. So I spent about 15 years after this becoming a dangerous alcoholic. That's how I learned how to deal with it. I crawled into a bottle and decided that was going to be my way to solve my particular problems. And as you can imagine, that didn't work out terribly well. Also, in the early 2000s, my daughter was diagnosed with a host of mental problems herself. She was diagnosed with ADHD and something that's called reactive attachment disorder. When she was 12, she got involved with an internet predator and had things happen to her on the internet that I don't even want to begin to describe to you here. When she was 14, she got involved with an MS-13 gang initiation, which, to be blunt, is a gang rape. That's what they did to her when she was 14 years old. So this reactive attachment disorder gave her no sense of danger, gave her no sense of self-preservation. So she was a danger to herself, she was a danger to us, and the only choice we had was to put her into residential care facility for 18 months down in Alabama. Now we had to liquidate our 401ks, we had to liquidate her college fund, and we had to borrow as much money as we could, and I still to this day pay $800 a month in service of this debt. Well over $100,000 that I will continue to pay on probably until the day I die. Isn't it interesting how much life changes over the course of just one generation? Medical bills that, fortunately enough, we have not lost everything we had, but there are plenty of families that would have lost everything just based on what happened to my daughter. So the worst part about paying all this money, the worst part about putting her into this residential care facility is that it just flat out didn't help. When I ran out of money, they ran out of service. So what we ended up having to do was we ended up putting her in an orphanage here in Claremont County, Midwestern Children's Home, where she stayed until she was 18 years old. Okay. Once she was 18, she aged out of that program, and she really had nowhere to go because we couldn't keep her with us. We had an infant son, and there was no way we were going to have her living under our roof. So she spent about 8 years of her life living kind of on the margins of society. She spent time living in the Middletown Women's Home. She spent time couch surfing. She spent some time on the streets, frankly. But if you fast forward to today, the good news is she's actually doing better. She lives with us now. We had her come back in, she lives with us. She was able to get her high school diploma, and she's on the process now, on the rebound of, she's in her mid-20s now, and she's doing much better than she's probably ever been in her life. But one of the things that really helped her change her life around was not so much things that she did, it was my complete approach to her. When she was younger, the cops would bring her home by the scruff of the coat, and they would say to her, you need to discipline this kid. You need to hit this kid. This kid has problems. You're not being a good parent. You're not disciplining this child quite enough. And that was the same kind of advice that I got from my father. The same kind of advice that I got from my wife's father. You need to hit this kid. Why aren't you hitting this kid? The kid won't behave. The kid won't listen. The kid's a rebel. You should discipline this kid. Well, I did it. I beat the living hell out of this kid. And don't you know, it had no effect on her whatsoever. It made her rebel worse. It was only when I changed my approach to her and showed her love and affection and kindness and acceptance that she changed her tune and she turned her life around. But one of the things that occurred to me is The difference with mental illness and the difference with cancer and other diseases is no one would ever say to a parent of a kid with cancer, if you hit this kid, they're going to have less cancer. But it's okay for someone, a parent of a kid with mental illness, to say, if you hit this kid, they're going to stop giving you so much trouble. I find that kind of interesting, the difference between the two. I understand cancer and mental illness are not exactly the same, but why do we treat people that are suffering no differently, all this differently? It doesn't quite make sense to me. And it's also about this time that I realized how isolating mental illness too. We suffered through this primarily alone because our families couldn't be of service to us because they didn't understand what was going on. They just saw a kid that was acting out and didn't behave properly. They saw two parents that they thought were just bad parents. Well, no, we had a kid that's got severe mental problems and she's beyond anything that we knew what to do. But we suffered through this alone. And I can't help but compare and contrast that. My son plays lacrosse and my son plays football. We've had two different families in that whole community of ours, that one family suffered through cancer and the other family suffered through a pretty debilitating heart attack. And the whole community rallied around these families. We put together what's called a meal train, where you bring meals to the families over a series of weeks so that they don't have to worry about the trouble of putting dinner together. We made sure the kids had rides to practice and rides to games. We took the kids to travel lacrosse events, all these kinds of things. The whole community rallied around these people. And it doesn't necessarily lessen their suffering completely, but it does lessen their suffering somewhat to know they've got a community of people around them. Well, with mental illness, you're alone. You are completely alone. There's not a group of people that are going to rally around you and help you, because mental illness, again, there's room for doubt. There's room for that. Well, your kid misbehaves, but that's a function of you being a bad parent. And that was the voice, that was the language that we always heard. That was the message we always got back from the community and the world around us. And that's what I'd like to try and end this on, is the fact that when you see someone out there, we all hate being at a restaurant and hearing the kid making a bunch of noise. We all don't want to be on the plane with the screaming baby, but we don't know what's happening in the lives of people around us when we see kids behave a certain way. You don't know what's going on in that family. You'll never know what's going on in that family. So my ask for you is, instead of being angry, being upset, or thinking, God, these people don't know what they're doing, maybe think about empathy. Because empathy is the only thing that turns things around for me, the only thing that turns around for my daughter, and the only thing I think that truly works. And people that suffer from mental illness, people that have people with mental illness in their family, they need your empathy, they need your understanding, they need your ear. So you guys gave me your ear tonight, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.